Then Daniels did something unexpected. Instead of backing down, he straightened his posture and narrowed his eyes. "I need to check something," he muttered, stepping away with his radio. But before he could walk off, Judge Hayes finally spoke, his voice cutting through the tension. "Officer Daniels, let me ask you something. What exactly are you looking for?" Daniels hesitated, and in that pause, the real story began to unfold. Daniels hesitated, his jaw tightening as if he were searching for an answer he didn't have. The crowd was still, waiting. Judge Hayes held his gaze, unflinching. "Tell me," he said again, his voice steady. "What are you looking for?" For the first time, Daniels looked unsure. He glanced at Sergeant Miller, then back at the ID in his hand. The truth was written all over his face. He had made a mistake. A big one. But instead of admitting it, he doubled down. "Just following protocol," he muttered. Sergeant Miller took a step forward. "That's enough, Daniels," he said firmly. "Judge Hayes doesn't need to prove anything." The weight of those words seemed to crush the last bit of Daniels' resistance. His face burned with embarrassment as he reluctantly handed the ID back. But just as the tension seemed to break, a voice from the crowd called out, "Wait, doesn't Daniels work security for Judge Hayes' courtroom?" A hush fell over the scene. Daniels' face drained of color. Judge Hayes narrowed his eyes. This wasn't just about suspicion. It wasn't just about power. This was personal. And suddenly, everything made sense. A murmur spread through the crowd as the realization sank in. Daniels had been inside Judge Hayes' courtroom before. He knew exactly who he was stopping. This wasn't about protocol. It was something deeper. Judge Hayes held Daniels' gaze, watching the flicker of guilt in his eyes. But instead of anger, the judge simply shook his head. "You knew," he said, more a statement than a question. Daniels opened his mouth as if to argue but stopped himself. There was nothing left to say. Sergeant Miller stepped forward. "Daniels will talk inside," he said firmly. The officer nodded stiffly and walked off, his shoulders tense. As the crowd slowly dispersed, Judge Hayes turned toward the courthouse, exhaling. He had spent years upholding justice, but today he had to demand it for himself. And as he walked through the doors, one thought stayed with him. Sometimes the real trials happened outside the courtroom. It was supposed to be just another morning at the courthouse. The sun had barely risen, and the air was thick with the weight of another busy day ahead. But what happened next would leave everyone speechless. As Judge Malcolm Hayes, a well-respected black judge, walked up the courthouse steps, a white police officer suddenly stopped him. His tone was firm, his stance unyielding. "Sir, this entrance isn't for the public," the officer said, eyeing him with suspicion. Judge Hayes, dressed in his usual suit and tie, calmly reached into his pocket, prepared to show his credentials. But before he could, the officer's hand hovered near his holster. What happened in the next few moments would challenge everything: assumptions, authority, and justice itself. No one saw it coming. And by the time the truth unfolded, it was clear this was no ordinary stop. Stay tuned. This story is just getting started. Judge Hayes froze for a moment, reading the officer's tense expression. He had been in this courthouse for years, making decisions that shaped lives. Yet here he was, treated like a stranger. He slowly pulled out his courthouse ID, his voice steady but firm. "I work here." The officer barely glanced at it. His eyes lingered on Judge Hayes's face, filled with doubt. "Step aside," he ordered. People passing by slowed down, sensing the tension but unsure if they should intervene. A courthouse clerk, recognizing Judge Hayes, rushed forward. "Officer, this is Judge Hayes," she said quickly. But the officer didn't relax. Instead, he hesitated, gripping his radio like he was considering calling for backup. Judge Hayes kept his gaze locked on the officer, waiting. He had seen moments like this before, from the bench in courtrooms. But never like this. And something about the officer's hesitation felt off. The officer's fingers hovered over his radio, his eyes darting between Judge Hayes and the ID in his hand. His hesitation wasn't just suspicion. It was something deeper. Something unspoken. The judge noticed it, but before he could say anything, the officer took a step closer. "I need to verify this," the officer muttered, speaking more to himself than anyone else. The courthouse clerk looked stunned. "Verify," she repeated. "He's in this building every day." Judge Hayes remained calm, but inside, a storm was brewing. This wasn't about ID. This was about something else. Power, perception, control. He had spent years upholding justice, yet now, outside the very place where he made life-altering decisions, his own authority was being questioned. A small crowd had gathered. Whispers spread. Court employees peered from the windows above. And then, just when it seemed the tension had reached its peak, something unexpected happened. Something that would change everything. The air grew thick with tension. Judge Hayes held his ground, his face unreadable. But inside, he could feel the weight of every eye on him. The officer clenched his jaw, his hand still resting near his radio. A decision had to be made, but what was he waiting for? What was running through his mind? That another officer stepped out of the courthouse, his uniform crisp, his expression shifting the moment he saw what was happening. "Officer Daniels," he called out, approaching quickly. "What's going on here?" Daniels stiffened, but before he could answer, the courthouse clerk jumped in. "He's stopping Judge Hayes from entering." The words hit like a shockwave. The second officer's face paled. His eyes flicked from Judge Hayes to Daniels, and something in his posture shifted, like he knew this had gone too far. Judge Hayes noticed it too. Something was unfolding behind the surface, and the next few seconds would determine everything. A heavy silence fell between them. Officer Daniels shifted uncomfortably, his fingers still hovering near his radio, but now his confidence seemed shaken. The second officer, Sergeant Miller, took another step closer, lowering his voice. "Daniels, do you know who this is?" Daniels didn't answer right away. His grip on control was slipping, and everyone could see it. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Phones were out now, recording everything. Judge Hayes exhaled slowly, his patience wearing thin. He had seen moments like this spiral out of control before. Blue and red lights flash in the night as officers pull over a sleek black car. A routine traffic stop, or so they think. The woman in the driver's seat is calm, her hands resting on the wheel as the officers approach. They ask for her license, their tone firm but professional. She hands it over without a word. But the moment they read her name, everything changes. Silence lingers. One officer glances at his partner, then back at the ID in his hand. Confusion flickers across his face, followed by something else, shock. The woman watches them, waiting. "Is there a problem, officers?" She finally asks. They hesitate. Because the name on that license belongs to someone they never expected to meet like this. The new chief of police. And now, the very officers who stopped her have to face the reality of who she is, and what happens next. The officers exchange uneasy glances, their hands suddenly stiff at their sides. One of them clears his throat, trying to mask his nerves. "Ma'am, can you step out of the vehicle?" he asks, his voice tight. The woman tilts her head slightly, studying them, then nods. She pushes open the door and steps onto the pavement, the glow of the streetlights casting sharp shadows around them. As she stands there, her presence commands attention. There's something in her posture, calm, confident, unreadable. The officers can feel it now. She's someone important. But why didn't they know? Why weren't they warned? One officer glances at her license again, her name now burning in his mind. Chief Daniels, the woman who, as of this morning, became their boss. She folds her arms, watching them with quiet patience. So she says finally, her voice steady, "What exactly seems to be the problem?"